Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Malthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. Today is August 26th. You're with the virtual City Club Forum. Welcome to you. Thank you for being with us. President Donald J. Trump's approach to foreign policy is both celebrated and criticized. And no matter who's providing the analysis, there is always recognition that his approach is a departure from the mainstream, a departure from what we might have referred to as the, quote, Washington consensus. Jim Sciutto is CNN's chief national security correspondent and anchor of CNN Newsroom. His new book provides a wide-ranging assessment of Donald Trump's presidency and approach to foreign policy. That book is called The Madman Theory: Trump Takes on the World. The title is not a clinical assessment of the 45th president. Rather, it's a metaphor highlighting how President Trump's often unpredictable behavior has unnerved enemies and allies alike and unsettled the global order. Today, Mr. Sciutto will talk about the lasting imprint President Trump has left on the world and U.S. foreign policy, and how that will shape America's place in the world in the future. A friend of the City Club's, Jim Sciutto, spoke last year about his previous book, The Shadow War, which is about espionage, disinformation, and other strategic power campaigns being waged by China and Russia. He was a foreign correspondent stationed in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Mr. Sciutto returned to Washington to cover the Defense Department, the State Department, and intelligence agencies for CNN in 2013. He's the recipient of many awards, including the Edward R. Murrow Award, the George Polk, and the Citation for Excellence from the Overseas Press Club for his undercover reporting from Myanmar, where he bucked government restrictions to tell the stories of that country's repressive regime. Mr. Sciutto will deliver some remarks and read passages from his book before turning, as we always do, to your questions. You can text those questions to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. And you can also tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them in. Also, I should mention that if you'd like to get yourself a copy of the book, Max Bax on Coventry Road in Cleveland Heights is offering a 20% discount to City Club members. Members should check their email or our member Facebook page for that discount code. And before we get to the conversation, I also want to thank our generous members, sponsors, donors, and others who support these virtual forums. For a full list, visit cityclub.org/thank-you. And a reminder, too, you can join them when you support our work by making a contribution or becoming a member at cityclub.org. And now it's my pleasure to welcome back to the City Club stage, such as it is on this virtual platform, Jim Sciutto. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Thanks to my college classmate, Noel Celeste, for also welcoming me back. I really wish I was just there again. You know, it's always so fun to see folks face to face, and I particularly enjoyed my visit to the City Club on the last tour last year. But as I say to everyone these days, 2020 is the year of the endless Zoom call. So here we are.
Here we are again, indeed.
Occupying our little boxes.
Yeah.
Doing our best to connect. But I'm also grateful to everyone who's joined today. Take time out of your day to listen to the story behind this and some of what I found in doing the reporting for this book.
Go ahead.
So I'll start at the beginning, just where the Madman Theory title comes from, an idea for crystallizing the Trump approach to foreign policy. Folks may find that term familiar from the Nixon years. Nixon was not so much the innovator of it, but perhaps the coiner of the phrase, and certainly a practitioner of the Madman Theory. I recount in the book how, in the depths of the Vietnam War, Nixon played it out. He had a conversation which was recorded in the White House. We have the tapes, and I read the transcripts. Had a conversation with Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor at the time, in which he instructed him to convey to North Vietnam in no uncertain terms that he, Nixon, was just mad enough to nuke North Vietnam. The intention, as discussed in that call, or in that conversation rather, with Kissinger, was to scare the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table and hopefully a more friendly terms in a peace agreement to end the war. Kissinger obliged. He communicated in no uncertain terms to North Vietnam that the boss just mad enough to order a nuclear strike. As it turned out, North Vietnam was not moved by it. They did not back down. They did not, as the history shows, give the U.S. more favorable terms, and we know how that war ended. But Nixon and his team would come to own the theory, the practice. They even called it the Madman Theory. H.R. Haldeman writes about it in his memoirs. They owned it. It was based in part on Nixon's misunderstanding of what happened in the Korean War, in that it was his impression that Eisenhower had done the same, threatened to nuke the North Koreans, and that helped in that war. I spoke with Tim Naftali, a Nixon historian who questions that telling of the Korean War, but there were others who trace this all the way back to Machiavelli, right? Make the other side think you're just crazy enough and somehow intimidate them or shock them into giving you what you want. Now, 50 years after Nixon, we have Donald Trump, who propagates his own version of the Madman Theory, though he doesn't call it that. But you've probably heard it before. I mean, even going back to his business days in The Art of the Deal, talking about keeping the other side off balance, swooping in late in the negotiations with a surprising demand or perhaps a surprising concession, but always keeping them off balance, maintaining control, and shocking them into concessions that you wouldn't get otherwise. As president, he has followed this similar approach in the most sensitive areas of national security, though, as I recount in the book, more often than not, an accident of his seat-of-the-pants decision-making than any sort of hardly delineated or thought-out strategy. It's just a product of the way he operates, changes his mind in the moment. The other innovation, if you want to call it that, of Trump's Madman Theory is that he's just as likely to unleash it on allies as he is on adversaries. And we saw that in trade negotiations with Canada and Mexico, the imposition of steel tariffs on Canada, and for which the president declared Canada a national security threat to the U.S. to justify those. People forget that, but he did. America's closest ally. Negotiations with NATO, holding a withdrawal of troops from Europe over the heads of NATO allies, which, of course, as you read in the headlines, the president is doing. He's doing the same with South Korea now, threatening to withdraw troops unless they increase their payments for the U.S. deployment there fivefold. The South Koreans resisting. We'll see if the president follows through on that. So the president carries this out across the board, really. And then another shocking dimension of it is that he's just as likely to use the Madman Theory, whether intentionally or not, on his own advisors. In this book, I speak only to people who served this president, appointed by him at the highest levels, and they describe multiple instances in which the president surprised his own team, contradicted his own team, contradicted stated U.S. policy, and his advisors say contradicted U.S. national security priorities in his decision-making on things from Syria to North Korea to Russia, notably, and even China and elsewhere. So that is the Madman Theory. That's the origin of it. And that's the sort of the version of it that Donald Trump has innovated and carried out as president. I'll walk you through some examples that I describe in the book that give you a sense of this. First, with North Korea. The president, as you know, for 4 years, took two approaches to North Korea, and that's why I have two chapters in the book on North Korea. The first being fire and fury, the second being the love affair. But I want to zero in particular on the most tense period between the U.S. and North Korea under Trump, and that was late 2017. It was just after North Korea had tested it was their sixth nuclear test, their largest by far. They seemed to have perfected a thermonuclear weapon. These were tense times. This was the discussion of fire and fury. My nuclear button is bigger than yours. You remember this, and even discussion of a bloody nose military strike on North Korea. I'm going to get to that in a moment. But at the height of this, as I recount in the book, the president's own advisors held back military options from him. The Pentagon resisted giving him military options because they were concerned that the president might use them and get the U.S. and North Korea into a bloody, bloody war. It's a remarkable thing and a remarkable sign of the distrust that his own advisors had in the president's decision-making. You may remember at the time this discussion of a bloody nose strike. The thing is, there is no one in the Pentagon who believed such a thing existed, because from their view, that any strike, even limited, would be interpreted by Pyongyang, by Kim Jong-un, as the beginning of a decapitation strike. There was no way to guarantee or even have confidence that there would be limits to escalation. And by the way, the US military did intelligence assessments of what the death toll of a limited interaction with North Korea would be, and that death toll was in the tens of thousands of people in the Seoul area, many of them South Koreans, but of course, many Americans, including deployed military there and their families. So with that in mind, in the heat of that, the Pentagon said, we don't want to give him these options because this might take us down a path that the president doesn't want, that we don't want. Joseph Yun, who was the top U.S. negotiator for North Korea at the time, told me that in addition to that, he conveyed to his North Korean counterparts, he was concerned, he didn't know what the president was going to do, that the president was unpredictable. And that's a message they had to send to the North Korean side, because again, they didn't want an unstoppable march to war. The South Koreans as well, I recount this in the book, commiserate to some degree with their North Korean counterparts to find some sort of off-ramp, because they felt, they worried that they were going to get caught in the middle of this and that they were going to be the principal victims of this. That is an example of not just Trump's madman theory in action, but how his own advisors saw the president's approach. They didn't trust his decision-making, and they tried to put up roadblocks as best they could to stop the commander-in-chief from putting the country on a path to war. It's a remarkable indictment, really, of the president's decision-making from folks serving his administration at the highest level. That approach, that concern, was not limited to North Korea. With Iran, in some of the most tense moments in 2019, I was told, and this is in the book as well, that his advisors communicated to the Iranian side, again, these rare circumstances of communications to the adversary, that they did not know what the president was going to do. He was unpredictable. And they did that not to gain leverage with the Iranians, but to limit the risk at the time of this country getting into a war it didn't want to get into, based on the president's bluster, threats, etc. That level of concern in 2019, that his own advisors would, again, as they did in 2017 with North Korea, communicate to the other side, we're nervous about this. He's unpredictable. It's a remarkable step to take. There were other forums where the president's madman theory played out, and where you see his advisors try to hem it in effect, hem in the president's worst impulses. Syria is a great example of this, because you had not one, but two examples of the madman theory in action over the course of 10 months, in December 2018 and again in October 2019. And you may remember this. In December, it was around Christmas time in 2018 when the president had a phone call with the Turkish President Erdogan. There was no discussion prior about anything regarding the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. President gets on the phone. Erdogan pushes him on that. President gets off the phone, tweets out, "We're done with Syria. I'm bringing home the troops. Job is done." He did not speak about this with U.S. commanders on the ground. U.S. commanders on the ground certainly did not speak about it with our Syrian Kurdish allies, didn't talk to his national security staff, did not consult with Republicans or Democrats, certainly, on Capitol Hill. In the wake of that, in the days that followed, first consternation, outrage from his own most senior advisors, from U.S. military commanders, and then a question. They started asking, as I recount in the book, wait a second, do we really have to do this right away? Did the president say exactly how many U.S. forces to withdraw and by when? No, he didn't. Okay, so how about we do this? How about we withdraw several hundred of them, not all of them. At the time, there were about 2,000. They withdrew close to 1,000. What if we withdraw a part of them, but keep a unit on the ground that can still accomplish the mission, defeating ISIS, protecting the Syrian Kurdish allies, and hope that his attention turns? And that's what happened. They withdrew some, but not all, and the president's attention turned, and they felt they dodged a bullet. 10 months later, October 2019, president gets on the phone again with the Turkish president Erdogan. No discussion in advance of a further withdrawal of U.S. forces. U.S. policy stated U.S. policy remained the same. Erdogan pushes again, says, listen, I can take care of this, withdraw from the border, give us a buffer zone, etc. The U.S. position of Turkish intentions there, by the way, is not that this was a buffer zone, but this was a Turkish incursion in there to take land away from the Kurds, who they consider their enemy. So Trump has the call, gets off the phone, tweets out again the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. Same level of consternation and outrage, particularly high at this point, because with the Turks coming in, you even had Republicans outraged and very much so in public, talking about leaving an ally to massacre by the Turks, which, by the way, did happen in circumstances. Many of them were killed by advancing Turkish forces. His advisors again say, okay, the gig is up. But then they begin to wonder, is there a way we can get around this? Is there a way that we can, again, keep some troops on the ground and hope that the president is satisfied with that? So they come up with a new idea, protecting the oil fields. You may remember this. The president has talked in both Iraq and Syria, illegally, mind you, that the U.S. could and has every right to profit from the oil there in territory that they've helped gain for people on the ground. Now, the U.S. is not doing that. The Pentagon would not do that. But they said, if we characterize this mission now as protecting the oil fields, maybe we'll give something to the president to hang his hat on. And that's what they did. They again withdrew some, but not all of the U.S. forces, as the president had tweeted, a few hundred, but enough to keep a footprint on the ground, do the counter-terror mission, help the Syrian Kurds, prevent them from being wiped out entirely, and yes, protect the oil fields, but do more. And they did that, and it worked. And to this date, those forces are still on the ground and still doing the counter-terror fight, and the Syrian Kurds have not been abandoned entirely. So again, with Syria, as you saw to some degree with North Korea and Iran, you see the president's own most senior advisors trying to manage, right, his bad decision-making. And that's not me calling it bad decision-making. It's the way they viewed it. And they viewed it that way, not so much as a matter of judgment, though they did have that judgment, but based on explicit U.S. national security policy for what the mission was there, fighting ISIS, protecting the Syrian Kurds, and trying to hold back Iranian forces, Russian forces, et cetera, that have been taking advantage as the U.S. has retreated. Again, it's a remarkable indictment of the president's decision-making. Now, in this book, as I mentioned, I spoke only to people who served in this administration, appointed by this president, served at the highest levels. You do have those critics, from Joseph Yun on North Korea, Fiona Hill on Russia, members of the senior Pentagon staff under Mattis on Syria, Iran, and other issues. You do, of course, have the president's defenders. And for this book, I spoke to Peter Navarro and I spoke to Steve Bannon. And they will still claim that, yes, the president keeps everybody off balance, allies and adversaries. But you know what? The allies kind of deserve it too. It's remarkable. I have this exchange in the book with Peter Navarro regarding Canada. And this made headlines in Canada yesterday, by the way, because a Canadian reporter reached out to me, read the book, and said, did Navarro really say this about Canada? And I said, yes, he did. And I shared with him actually the audio of our interview. But I want to read this section here because it gets to sort of a general, the extent of the Madman Theory and as it applies not just to adversaries, but to our closest friends. And by the way, this is making headlines across Canada today because, well, understandably, Canadians have bled with U.S. soldiers from Normandy all the way to Afghanistan, and they still are today. This is from early in the book. I reminded him, this is Peter Navarro, I reminded him how bravely Canadian forces have fought and continue to fight in Afghanistan. Canada provided forces without the restrictions on frontline operations other allies demanded, and they paid with their lives. On several embeds in Afghanistan, I could always spot the Canadian forces because they would build a wooden roller hockey rink to satisfy their ice hockey obsession. They paid their dues in blood. And here's Navarro. Were they doing us a favor, or were they bought into the idea that they needed to do that as part of the global effort against terrorists? I mean, if they were just doing us a favor, maybe their government should have been thrown out of office. I mean, every time that a Canadian shows up in uniform, it's doing us a favor. How's that work? Let's take Canada. I mean, what's good about Canada? Navarro asked. They have some of the highest dairy barriers to entry of any country in the world. What's good about that? What's good about Canada being a transshipment point now for some of the Chinese stuff that we've been countervailing? It's just Canada. It has its own national interests and self-interests. So that's Peter Navarro, the president's trade advisor by title, but as you've seen with his forward position, even on the coronavirus response, this is one of the president's closest advisors on a whole host of things. Dismissing, really, I mean, America's closest ally, I guess, with Britain, vying for a position at the top. But that is the way that they view they view even our friends, that this madman theory applies to everyone. And why is that? It's not just about gaining advantage. It's because the president is skeptical, frankly, of alliances. He has a zero-sum view of the world described by his advisors, and by the way, his supporters and his critics, because Bannon and Navarro defend this view. But he has this view of allies that it's all transactional. There's very little allowance for history, for shared values, even for sharing of intelligence for counterterror. H.R. McMaster, who was his national security advisor, told me that he had real frustration with the president because he couldn't convince the president of the benefits of these alliances. And it's interesting because Fiona Hill, the president's, of course, senior advisor on Russia, said that in many ways, he's more hostile to allies than he is to adversaries. Why is that? Because in his view, we've done so much for allies, protecting Europe with NATO in his view, protecting Canada, protecting Japan with our nuclear umbrella, that they owe us more. It's a remarkable view. In a way, he demands more of them and has a more negative view of them than adversaries, because he's like, that's what adversaries do. They screw with us. But our allies, when they screw with us, they're screwing with us and they owe us too. It's a remarkable view. And that's not just something that kind of stays below the surface. We see that in the president's decision-making. It is why the president can summarily withdraw 9,000 troops from Germany in a fit of pique with the German chancellor, in a move literally no one in his government supports or defends. Not in the Pentagon, no Republicans on Capitol Hill either, save for maybe Rand Paul, because the president doesn't see the obligation there. It has effects. It may, in a second term in particular, lead to withdrawal of some or all of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula, remarkably, given the attention he's given to North Korea, but because he looks at South Korea and says, what have you done for us? Why do we owe you anything? That is the madman theory in action. I want to just close on another section here, because what strikes me about Trump and this approach is that the things that his critics find damaging, his defenders don't so much say it ain't happening, right? Contradict you, just say it's actually a good thing. That what some see as folly, his defenders see as wisdom, part of this kind of three-dimensional chess, and it's all working out in the end. Just going to read a closing line here. In trying to crystallize his foreign policy, I keep coming back to one phrase used by former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. In a speech at Georgetown University in February 2020, she described his approach as, quote, an amoral, keep them guessing foreign policy that substitutes threats, fear, and confusion for trust. For Ambassador Yovanovitch, it was clearly a criticism, but interestingly, it was not far off from the description some of his allies used to praise his approach. As with so many things Trump, where some see folly, others see virtue. Americans will have to decide for themselves if they share that vision of the country. So that's a brief introduction to the madman theory, as innovated, modified, espoused by President Trump, and as seen by people who served him. And I look forward to your questions.
This is wonderful. Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. We appreciate the briefing. Jim Sciutto is CNN correspondent. His new book is called The Madman Theory, Trump Takes on the World, which, of course, the madman there is not a clinical assessment, more of a metaphor. Jim Sciutto, we're delighted to have you. If you have a question for Mr. Sciutto, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can tweet it at the City Club, and we will work it into the program. I want to ask you this question that came in. If the Trump presidency heads, as polls indicate, to its end, what must the next administration do to bring the country back into compliance with not only the rule of law, so that's one question really, but the vital role it once played as a beacon of hope, security, and leadership in the world? It's a large.
It is. Well,
question.
The first question is, of course, what happens in November, right? We don't know. I will say that, just holding out that possibility, that his advisors, much like John Bolton has said, believe that, for instance, on a NATO, right, that the half measures become full measures, right? That instead of just withdrawing some troops, the president might just out and out withdraw from the alliance. And that is a consistent concern I heard from a lot of advisors, that things were somewhat half measures during his first term, go whole hog in the second term. Not just a reduction of forces in Afghanistan, but they're all gone. Not just a reduction of forces in Syria, but they're all gone. Damn the consequences. Look at the South Korean peninsula. Look at other agreements with Canada and elsewhere. So that's a concern. Let's set that aside for a moment. If he loses, what does the next president need to do? I mean, listen, you can imagine a speech soon after he takes office from Joe Biden reiterating American commitment to NATO and other alliances, visits to shake the hands of the folks, and either a reversal of decisions or stopping in their tracks of decisions that the president made. For instance, the withdrawal of troops from Germany takes time. And I've spoken to folks at the Pentagon who are kind of winking and nodding and saying, well, there's not a lot we could do before November, hoping against hope that they don't have to withdraw those forces. So some of that could be in a speech, some of that could be in moves that are reversed. Here's the problem: is that confidence, like with anything, even in your personal and professional lives, right? It's easily lost, difficult to gain, difficult to build, and difficult to gain back. What is, look at the Iranian nuclear deal, for instance. The U.S. negotiated that under one president with its allies and with China and Russia and with Iran, pulled out after one election. What's the guarantee that the next, if there's a Iran deal 2.0 or North Korean nuclear deal on the same model, that lasts only as long as the next election, right? That we are locked in something of a pendulum swing in policies in this country, not just domestically, but under Trump at least, and it remains to be seen if he's an anomaly, but under Trump at least, that things that used to be bipartisan, lasting positions of the U.S. government have become partisan things, So those questions can be partially answered by statements and moves initially, but they'll only really be answered over time, over years, as to whether the U.S. can be counted on in the same way going forward as it has in the past. Just reading, I'll tell you, it was like reading the commentary, the reaction to Navarro's comments on Canada. Now that that's sort of become a story in Canada in the last 24 hours, the military commanders there are up in arms, right? I mean, they commanded troops that lost a couple hundred guys in Afghanistan after NATO, by the way, invoked the Mutual Defense Article after 9/11 to protect the U.S., right? So, statements and decisions, et cetera, help, but some of this damage doesn't go away right away, right? And you can understand why folks would have questions, that lasting questions based on our current politics here.
Does he run the risk? This is another question that came in was actually texted to me, not to the other number that people are supposed to text questions to, which is fine. But when does the madman become the boy who cried wolf? If he keeps making these threats and not fulfilling them, do people take him? Do you run the risk of nobody taking him seriously?
Well, based on the record, no one really did. It didn't work. It didn't work. Nor, the view, and it's interesting to hear Pompeo try to make the case for this last night, the success with North Korea. I mean, it's just comical, right? They started the North Korea, maximum pressure, negotiate, fire and fury, switch to diplomacy with this phrase, complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization. They haven't used that phrase for years, right? Because it didn't move one iota in that direction. In fact, today, North Korea has more, not less, nuclear weapons than when this started. Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were when this started. China and Russia have not backed off any of their malign activities, right? I mean, the president talk about this a lot in the book, right? That one of the most consistent features of his foreign policy is deference to Russia. Well, that clearly has not deterred Russia. I mean, they just poisoned the opposition leader. I mean, with barely a blip from the U.S. And China, yes, the Trump administration has stood up to China, but China has not been intimidated either. So who are the great intimidated by this, right? Who's backed off in the face of this new respect for America? I mean, cite the examples, and they can't really, based on the last chapter of the book is before and after. I do it for each of these countries, where it stood 4 years ago, where it stands today, and the record's pretty clear that the approach has failed.
So even Bannon and Navarro couldn't cite a real, I mean, because people will often say, look at China, he stood up to China, look at how he brought North Korea to the table. But even in those cases, there's no real gains to be.
Well, they'll claim that privately, though. I'll tell you, the China hawks in this administration that include Bannon and Navarro considered that phase one trade deal a capitulation. Right? Didn't get anything of the big picture stuff. I mean, they put a nice spin on it, in public, but in private, they consider it a walk back, right? And they will blame the kind of Mnuchin camp. They sort of view him as a China dove, but at the end of the day, it's the president's deal. So little progress to cite on China, except the fact that the U.S. is standing up to them more. But in terms of effect of that, the trade manipulation continues. China has effectively grabbed Hong Kong, right, in the last couple of months. So whether it's changed the fundamental dynamic, there's very little proof of that. And then it's much easier on North Korea or Iran just to say, okay, what you had then and what you have now.
This question from an audience member, and if you have a question, text it to 330-541-5794. I think it was claimed during the RNC that President Trump brought home a record-setting number of American political prisoners. If so, does that prove the efficacy of his foreign policy approach?
Well, on that front, yeah. Credit where credit is due. And I bend over backwards to give credit where it's due. And I'm someone who spent years in China, for instance, decades actually, sadly, witnessing China's misbehavior in terms of trade, stealing from U.S. companies, treatment of dissidents, etc. And I write a somewhat heartfelt section of the book introducing that topic based on my own experience of watching the U.S. effectively capitulate to China during my time when I was there as a diplomat. So I, in terms of credit, the standing up matters, right? It does. It's just much harder to see where that has changed the fundamental dynamic. On bringing hostages home, yes, this administration has had success on that. Listen, the administration, I talk about this in the book, took a step in killing Qasem Soleimani, which previous Republican and Democratic presidents hesitated to do, did not do. They thought the consequences would be too dangerous, and kind of got away with it, right? Not without the conflagration that some had predicted. The question is, has that reduced, certainly not reduced Iranian progress towards a nuclear weapon. That has gone forward, and it hasn't, that you can cite, reduced Iranian military aggression in the region, right? So you got to give credit where credit is due, but then if you want to judge the policy as a whole, you have to look at each of these national security spheres and say, have they moved the ball forward or not? And if you look at the record, it's just hard to find big picture where they've done that.
You spoke before about the kind of transactional nature, or the way in which Donald Trump views things and views foreign policy as transactional. Has that, if you look at it through that lens, has he gained anything, or has the U.S. gained anything by by treating NATO or treating our alliances as transactional?
Got some more money, right? I mean, those countries many of those countries have spent more on defense. That's good, right? And Bush and Obama were pushing them too, and they didn't do it fast enough. At the same time, you have weakened NATO. You've reduced a forced presence there at a time of greater, not lesser, Russian aggression. Just watch what's happening in Belarus right now. And raised questions in the mind of our own allies as to the U.S. commitment to that alliance, right? Alliances they're feel documents, right? I mean, they're only as good as people's confidence in them, the people who are in the alliance and the people who the alliance is allied against. And, the president has publicly raised questions about whether the U.S. really needs to abide by the mutual defense portion of that treaty, right? Putin is listening to those comments. And what does he do to then test those limits, right? Look, for instance, about Russian interference in Belarus right now. The U.S. president has nothing definitive about that yet. Yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm concerned about it. Russia only listens to what the president says, right? The one statement this week, I think, came from the spokesman for the U.S. ambassador to Russia. They don't care, right? If Trump is saying he doesn't really care that much, what's going to hold him back, So you got more money, but your own allies, France and Germany, are saying they can't rely on the U.S. anymore. That's concerning, You may squeeze more money out of South Korea for the deployment there, but keep in mind, your standoff there is with North Korea. How does North Korea perceive a fissure in the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea? Likely has an advantage, certainly not intimidated by it. What is gain then? For what so transactional in dollar terms, fine. What has it done in terms of U.S. national security and the national security of our partners? Different calculation and hard to see where the gain is, and pretty easy to identify the damage.
Here's another question for you. Could you address the standing of the U.S. in East Asia? We seem more isolated and alone as we look west than in a long time. Who is standing with us?
In East Asia. So, that was a fundamental miscalculation of this administration, that if your focus was going to be on standing up to China, very reasonably so, you'd imagine you'd be stronger if you got your allies on board with it because they have the same concerns. That was the TPP, right? But the president views all these trade treaties, or at least ones negotiated by his predecessors, as unfair or the worst deals ever. So he pulled out of that just as he was launching a justified attack on Chinese trade practices. Would that have been stronger if you had the allies on board as you were doing that? There is, the go it alone approach underplays your hand. His own diplomats talk about that in the book, or on North Korea, right? You'd imagine you'd be stronger. And actually, early on, the Trump administration, China was already on board with sanctions. Early on, got China on board for a more forceful policing of those trade restrictions. But as the U.S. and China kind of blew up against each other, that partnership has weakened. All these things are connected, right? The other thing to keep in mind is, those U.S. forces in South Korea are not just about North Korea; they're also about China, right? It's a forced presence that China watches warily, and it's about forced projection for the U.S. there. So, if you're threatening to withdraw those forces, kind of punish the South Koreans into paying more, China views that as weakness in that alliance. And Joseph Yun and others talk a lot about in my book how South Korea, seeing that, has been moving closer to China. And that's a worry for the U.S. Not that they're going to join arms with them, but South Korea's had to play a double game there because China's, they're right on China's doorstep, and they've seen South Korea make greater overtures to China. So in the midst of this, where's the grand strategy in there? If China is your main goal of hemming them in, but you've exiled your allies on the trade issue and on the key national security dispute, North Korea, you've created bigger space with your closest ally on that, South Korea. It's about connecting the dots, and that's where his advisors can talk all about banging the drum for holding China's feet to the fire. Sorry for using multiple cliches in one sentence, but they can bang the drum. But where is the strategic advantage? And that's where they just have more trouble making the argument.
So in the end, there are no Asian nations standing with us. It sounds like what you're saying, without actually coming out and fully saying it, is that we've simply further isolated ourselves.
Yes. I'm not saying no one's standing with us.
But the allies or the former allies who may be standing with us are sort of standing with us out of inertia, not out of renewed commitment.
And you're creating you're creating distance, right, between you and your allies. Certainly with South Korea, Japan too, right? I mean, the president when he was out in Asia, and I was there for all three of these summits with Kim, he'll just say in public, do we really need this defense treaty with Japan? How does China view that? He'll say, why don't we just give Japan nukes? Well, the reason we don't is because we don't want to create a bigger nuclear arms race out there. And then South Korea thinks they need nukes. And before you know, there are a whole host of reasons you have it, but the president's thinking is screw it. Just let them have it.
I don't mean to laugh at what you're saying, but he very much lives in this sort of Zen-like moment in the present. Does the ahistorical philosophy with which he operates, does that inform this as well?
Yeah, he doesn't read, right? It's just, he doesn't. And his sense of history is frankly often wrong. I'll tell a couple stories about this. I tell a story in the book about how his national security team realized very early on he was not reading his intelligence briefings. So under H.R. McMaster, they came up with an idea. He's like, okay, and those briefings, by the way, are just a few pages. We're not talking about 100 pages. So McMaster's team boiled them down to 3 bullet points on note cards, hoping that would get the president to at least absorb the most important information.
Kind of like Axios version.
Exactly. Axios version of our nation's most sensitive intelligence. Imagine that. So they do that, and then they realize pretty quickly he's only reading the first 2 of 3 bullet points. 2 of 3 bullet points. So they start concentrating the most important information in the first 2 bullet points and kind of use the third one as a throwaway line, hoping he'd at least get through those 2. Then they begin to realize he's not reading those either. And they know that because in the briefings, when they would bring up stuff of import, it would be clear that it was the first time he was hearing it. So it's a problem. It goes to, with this latest Russian bounty stuff, the fact that that was in his written briefing, not his oral one, I kind of believe that he didn't read it in there, right? That's now. Then it was public, and then his advisors clearly did brief him, and then he dismissed it out of hand. So you had that too. He's like, oh, it's another Russia hoax problem. But the idea that he didn't read, something like that in there is plausible to me because we know that he doesn't read, doesn't bother. The bigger issue, right? A sense of history. He doesn't have a great sense of history, and he's wrong on some stuff. I tell the story in the book and he's often influenced by several people in his ear, which is what his team would talk about a lot. There were folks on the phone, whether it was Tucker Carlson or old business friends or Vladimir Putin. U.S. intelligence believes that Vladimir Putin has been an influence on a few things in terms of the president's view of the world. One, his hostility towards European leaders. I'm talking Western European leaders, NATO allies, Merkel, etc. That has influenced the president's kind of distrust of them, dismissal of them, anger with them, but also even that Putin has influenced Trump's understanding of World War II, the history of World War II. So when you hear Trump a couple of months ago, if you don't remember these comments, look them up, say, well, Germany, and this is true, of course, Germany was the aggressor in World War II, but that Russia was always kind of a peaceful player in that war. Well, that forgets 1939 and von Ribbentrop, right? Splitting up Poland in 1939. By the way, that retelling of the history of the war is right in line with Kremlin talking points, Kremlin revisionism about the actual, not outcome, but how the war played out, how it started, etc. And his own advisors talk about how that's one influence on him.
Is that, Jim, is that coming through television, through like these, RT and OAN?
Some. He definitely watches a lot of TV. It influences his view of the world, right? It influences policy decisions, stuff he sees there. And it goes in both directions, right? Like he influences their coverage, but they influence his. I tell a story in the book about how when the president had initially ordered retaliation against Iran for shooting down that drone over international waters, as the planes were in the air, you'll remember he called back the attack. His official explanation was he just found out that retaliation risked 150 Iranian lives, and he judged that was not a reciprocal response to shooting down a drone. That's a reasonable assessment. You or I can make the same decision. Fact is, he would have been briefed on that at the very beginning. It would not have been news once the planes were in the air. But what did happen is that he had a conversation with Tucker Carlson, who told him, if you get us into a war in Iran, you're going to be toast in the next election because you said you were going to be the man who ended the wars, the endless wars. So
Wait, how do you know that? I know that's the conversation that happened.
Well, and I'm not the only one to report that. The New York Times reported that too. Mm-hmm. From people who knew firsthand.
Jim Sciutto's book is Madman Theory, and you can get a 20% discount if you're a member and you buy it at our friends at Maxbacks on Coventry Road. If you have a question for Jim, tweet it at the City Club or text it to 330-541-5794. This conversation gets more and more fascinating, Jim, the deeper we get into it. Another question for you: what impact has Trump foreign policy had on multilateralism, and how is this problematic?
He likes to go it alone, right? In trade agreements, in interactions, peace agreements, for instance. Remember, if you look at Middle East peace, right, the president early on had talked about kind of a grand agreement with the Palestinians. He put Jared Kushner in charge of it. What we got last week or the week before was this UAE-Israel agreement, which is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But it certainly doesn't improve the situation between Israel and Palestine. So, there's a lot of one-on-one, which you can argue in certain circumstances works, right? And in other circumstances, it weakens your hand. China being an obvious example, or even, Syria, right? When it's one-on-one discussion with the Turkish president, who has their own interests and frankly not aligned with U.S. interests there, and you're not bringing your Syrian Kurdish partners into it, or even the European allies. You look at that, by any measure, Erdogan got the better of that deal, right? Turkey got the better of the deal. Didn't seem to serve U.S. interests or U.S. allies' interests on the ground. For all the talk of the unilateralism, tough guy kind of thing, getting the U.S. more rather than less, when you watch it play out, that's often not the case.
Jim Sciutto, when you spoke earlier about military advisors slow walking his orders and State Department staffers kind of slow walking commands and orders, it brought to mind the phrase "the deep state," which you did not utter, but I am injecting into this conversation, and then and it's connected to this question from one of our audience members: if reelected, how does Trump find people with international experience and expertise to serve, which is not necessarily something he's prized in this current administration, or will they only be figures with their own political aspirations, as in Nikki Haley and Secretary Pompeo?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Nikki Haley left, right? She got out. She's already gone. Would she come back in a second term? I don't know. Listen, as you watch it play out over time, he's had more trouble filling these roles with people with deep credentials, qualifications, right? He, more and more has exiled folks who challenge him. And it's hard to identify who in the current mix is willing to tell him inconvenient information or disagree with him. There's more agreement at the top, a tightening circle, right? And by the way, a lot of acting folks in positions that are meant to be Senate confirmed. I mean, another side of this, right? It's not just the president. The Senate, under GOP control, has basically ceded its constitutional authority to confirm senior level cabinet officials, right? I mean, I've lost count of how many are acting, but they don't even care, right? Just let it go. They don't challenge, and that's its own powers there. It's pretty remarkable. In a second term, I don't know. I mean, you have a lot of people who stuck it out. Well, you have a lot of people who stuck it out because they're true believers. You have others who, and these aren't necessarily black and white lines. There's some gray areas, but you do have others who believe they're kind of doing their duty for their country by sticking around, if not at the senior level, at the middle level, or just below that. But there have been less and less over time. People have their limits. So in a second term, I don't know. I mean, a lot of these folks have aspirations for 2024, the ones who stayed at the senior level, like a Pompeo, Haley, who got out. At some point, they're going to look out for number one. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, Fox has pretty much been rated at this point for senior level positions, but I guess there are always more. Right?
You, in the book, you talk about Russia, Ukraine, China, North Korea, and Syria. You don't talk about Mexico at all, where I think many of his supporters would find there has been success, that he can declare some sort of win in reducing the number of undocumented immigrants, in erecting a wall, in reducing the number of immigrants and refugees who are coming from Central America through Mexico. Yeah. He's getting Mexico he has the Remain in Mexico policy. Do you want to talk about his relationship with our North American counterpart, our North American neighbors to the south?
It depends on what you call success, right? I mean, yes, reduced illegal immigration, but also legal immigration. I mean, our refugee intake into this country, richest country in the world, is down to nearly zero. I've had conversations with Stephen Miller, who's his kind of Svengali on immigration policy. He wants to reduce legal immigration. He does, and they have successfully on many fronts, whether it be refugees or even policies instituted under COVID, but policies that were already kind of bubbling prior to COVID and used now. I mean, I've spoken with Stephen Miller. He makes a case for a less diverse America, frankly.
The rationale is that it's better for the American worker because there's less competition, allegedly.
It is a blood and soil argument, man. It is. I mean, I've sat down face to face from him, and he describes what vision of America is. It's not a conspiracy theory. I'm going to say it explicitly in his public comments as well. But it's about a vision of America that's being diluted, right, by the more foreigners who come in. It's not a caricature of it. It's the way it plays out. I mean, listen. I mean, the Muslim ban. It was predicated on a security risk. It is still there, and that's largely been dropped. It's about fewer Muslims coming into the country, right? Mm-hmm. And that policy has been expanded since then. If you look at this happened with Nigeria and elsewhere just in the last year or so. But I mean, remember the comment about shithole countries, right? There are non-security explanations given for reducing the number of folks coming from those countries too. It's explicit. Mm-hmm. It's not implicit. It's explicit. It gets lost in the kind of cacophony of news out of there. Listen, personally, I get the I think we all do get the push to reduce illegal immigration, but an essential part of it is reducing legal immigration as well. It's about a vision of the country, and a vision of the country carried out by people who are. I mean, we're all children. We're either immigrants' children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants, depending on how far back you go. I mean, Trump's family, his wife's family, and so on. By the way, chain migration, as it's known, was exactly how. Anyway.
Yes, how the First Lady brought her family.
I shake my head at it, but just read the public comments of these folks on what the policy is and what the attention is, and it's not just about illegal immigration.
And I apologize for my lack of a poker face, but the blood and soil phrase is very much connected to Europe's Nazi past, and it's an upsetting phrase. It's a trigger. Yeah. What should we make of the president's outreach to India and Prime Minister and Narendra Modi?
It's interesting.
Yeah. And what do you try to get in South Asia? What's going on there?
He sees a kindred spirit. For the president, his relationships are very personal. Mm-hmm. He believed that his relationship with Kim Jong-un could fundamentally change, that dynamic there. It didn't work, right? He believed that his relationship with Xi Jinping could change that dynamic too. Didn't work either. He still praises it sometimes. He believes his personal relationship with Putin can change that dynamic. He thinks it has, but in fact, Russia has become more, not less aggressive over the past 4 years. And you can see that in a number of fronts, whether it's poisoning people abroad, whether it's interactions between Russian military aircraft and ships with U.S. military aircraft and ships, Russian election interference, right, on a whole host of fronts. So, he imagines the personal relationship can move these things, but when you look at the record, it doesn't. India, listen, there's a better argument for it, right? I mean, here's a democratic country, and a lot of shared interests, and of course, India has its own tensions with China, so you can imagine strategically, being on the same page with India can help counter that relationship. The other bit is the populist bit, right? I mean, this is a president who likes populist leaders and praises them, and Modi has his if you followed it, populist issues at home with the country's hundreds of millions of Muslims, right? And dealings there and the kinds of language he's had. So there's some worrisome aspects to it, and there's some understandable strategic aspects.
Mm-hmm. How much do you attribute his deferment to other national leaders on foreign policy issues to political ignorance? How much to deference to other more experienced authoritarian figures? And how much to a more sinister nature of simply looking out for his own best interests?
That final point is one that is a suspicion his own advisors have. I'll talk about Russia. I asked everybody about his relationship with Putin and why, and then why this deference to Russia, in contradiction again to stated U.S. national security policy. Some of his advisors have their own suspicions. They do about personal motivations there, vulnerabilities. They do. I didn't print those in great degree because I didn't want to print stuff that they didn't know, as opposed to we're theorizing about. But I will say, and a lot of this is on the record, and you'll see it in the book, that their best explanation, friendliest if you want to call it that, but their best explanation for his affinity for Putin is that he admires him. He just simply admires the man. He envies his power to some degree. And he shares, I touched on this a little earlier in the talk, he shares Putin's nihilistic view of the world, this idea that we're all dirty players in a dirty game. There's no, America's not exceptional. We're all dirty players in a dirty game, and it's sort of like whatever you can win in any interaction is fine. All bets are off, no holds barred. There are examples of that. You could see it in his public comments. If you remember the interview with Bill O'Reilly back in 2017, O'Reilly pressed him and said, "Well, Putin's a killer," and he said, "Well, are we any better?" More recently, with this Afghan bounty intelligence, when he was reminded then, this is not the first time Russia has done this. In 2018, the U.S. had even harder intelligence. Russia was supplying arms to the Taliban. The president said, well, we supplied arms to the Taliban in the 80s when the Russians were there. No distinction between U.S. and Russian behavior, even when the lives of U.S. forces are on the line. He just has he shares with him a kind of nihilistic view, and he senses some sort of brotherhood there. Now, the view of the president's own senior intelligence officials is that Putin knows that Trump admires him and takes advantage of that. And sometimes with effect. So another personal relationship where his own advisors see the president getting taken advantage of rather than somehow, regenerating respect for American leadership.
Jim Sciutto is CNN's chief national security correspondent, anchor of CNN Newsroom, and author of the new book, The Madman Theory: Trump Takes on the World. Jim, thanks for making time for us. We really appreciate it.
I appreciate all the good questions from you and the folks watching, and I appreciate all of you taking the time. If you do me the honor of reading the book, I would love to hear your critiques.
You can find him on Twitter at Jim Sciutto. And if you buy the book over at our friends at Max Backs on Coventry Road in Cleveland Heights, you will receive a 20% discount as long as you're a City Club member. You can check out cityclub.org or email us or check out the member Facebook page for more details. Jim, thank you so much.
One more offer, Dan, if you'd like, just since I'm not there in person. If I were there in person, of course, I would sign everybody's copy. Since I can't be, maybe we could arrange, Dan, and I'll talk to Noel as well. I've offered this to other folks. I could get nameplates and sign them to people and send them out. If folks, you again do me the honor of buying a copy, I'll figure out a way to get you a sign.
We'll do that. We'll take you up on that offer. Absolutely. And if you can sign my Kindle version, that would be awesome.
Fair enough. I'll do it. Let me just go through the screen here.
All right, Jim. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
All right. Take care of yourself. Our forum today is part of our Authors in Conversation series, which is sponsored by the John P. Murphy Foundation and by the residents of Cuyahoga County through a public grant from Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. Our community partner today is the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. City Club virtual forums are sponsored by Bank of America, the Cleveland Foundation, Eaton, the George Gund Foundation, KeyBank, Nordson, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and PNC, along with many other generous members, sponsors, and donors, which you can find at our website at cityclub.org/thank you. You can join them in supporting our work when you become a member or make a contribution at cityclub.org. I'm Dan Multhrop. Please stay strong. Please stay healthy. Please wash your hands and keep your distance and wear a mask and stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. Our forum is adjourned.